there. They had a hell of a flood in Johnstown in the 30s. And he died, as we all will. Went to heaven. The first cocktail party there, he was told by St. Peter that he would be asked to recite the most important thing that he had done while he was in earthly form. And he said, heck, that's easy. I survived the Johnstown flood. And just St. Peter, wasn't there anything else? He said, no, that was a hell of a flood and I survived. St. Peter thought for him, I said, okay, but just remember, Noah will be in the audience. Right there. I thought I'd run through my aviation's been my life, as is probably has for most of you here. I thought I'd run through my experiences, and then it's advertised, and I hope it will involve a question and answer period. As a matter of fact, I've been told by Steve Volt that those of you that don't participate will see it reflected on your next bill from Aerotronics. I think my association with aviation, my love for aviation, started in 1933 when my father and I went for a ride in a Waco in Dayton, Ohio, open Waco, and I was mesmerized with it. My aunt, who lived in Dayton, had an acquaintance at a pilot, an Army pilot, who gave me a book called The Red Eagle, which I still have, and also a little model airplane that actually flew. And I was hooked. While the rest of my contemporaries in grade school were reading Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, I was reading The Red Eagle. All this crap about space travel didn't mean a thing to me. I wanted to see airplanes. And I grew up building model airplanes incessantly. Finally, when I was in high school in 1944, the same year that Doug started, I was able to gather enough money by working all week to solo in a Taylor craft. The rates then were $9 an hour with an instructor, $7 an hour solo. And one of the unusual things about that period, as my experience, was my instructor was a lady, which was not usual or not ordinary in that time period. But she was great, and I was hooked even further after that. In order to gain even lower cost, I joined a flying club and flew a Porterfield. How many of y'all have heard of an old Porterfield? It's a great airplane. It was a better airplane than the trailer craft, in my estimation. But nevertheless, I have to confess, lost interest in flying for a whole year because my interest then turned to girls, but particularly to one girl who has now been my wife for 66 years. And that was a great thing to divert, because it was marrying her was the best thing that ever happened to me. She not only supported my aviation activity, she embraced them. And when we were doing air shows, and I in a P-51, and I told her, look, Susan, if I tell you to get out of this thing, you're going to have to get out and use the parachute. So she wasn't sure she had the guts to do that, so she went down and jumped out of the airplane. The damn fool, in order to make sure she'd have the guts to do it. That's the kind of support I had all my life. So anyway, I tried to get into the aviation program out in '46 after I graduated from high school, but there was no out. One thing the country had at that time was a surplus of pilots, everybody coming back from World War II. So I was fortunate enough to pick up an appointment to West Point, and 4 years later, 25% of the graduates from West Point went to the Air Force Academy. I went to the Air Force because there was no Air Force Academy. 25% of the graduates from Annapolis went to the Air Force Academy, went to the Air Force. So that's how I got into the Air Force. Started out at Sherman, Texas, in T6s. It was a rather benign experience, as a matter of fact. The T6 is a handful on the ground, and we had quite a few washouts. But the instructors there were reasonable people, and as a matter of fact, I didn't see much difference between the civilian world and the Air Force at that point. Then I went to fighter school at Williams Air Force Base. The commander at Williams was Colonel Spicer, later General Spicer, who had headed the 357th Fighter Group in England, had been shot down, jumped into the English Channel, was washed ashore, and then put in a stalag for the rest of the war. He was one tough cookie by every standard. The only person on the base tougher than him was the group commander, the training commander, a guy by the name of Leon Gray. He lined up all the new second lieutenants in the base theater. And I'll never forget that day. He said, "Look around to your right and left, because the one on your person on the right is probably going to be dead, and the one on the left is going to be washed out. Good luck." He said, "Don't come to me complaining about your wives being pregnant or sick or anything else." He said, "I think wives ought to be government property. Check the new one at the next base." I went home and told Susan that. Susan, who was 7 months pregnant, and she wasn't impressed at all. Later on, we met Colonel Gray, who was then retired and is as old as I am now. And she walked up to him and she said, "You know, Colonel, I didn't like you." And he said, "I don't blame you." He was a good guy. So at Williams, everything changed. The motto for the Air Force then was "Every man a tiger." The last thing you did, you never pre-flighted your airplane. The message was, if you don't trust your crew chief, who can you trust? I don't remember ever having a written checklist. Never did use a checklist, but it was all memorized. And Gray was right. The washout rate was remarkable. It was something like 50%. People were washed out. And when we finally graduated on the 4th of August in 1951, I felt that we had accomplished something, and I felt every man was a tiger. Just to give you an example of the type of flying there, I can remember flying in a 4-ship formation about 50 feet above the Colorado River, the whole length of the Grand Canyon. Things that would be impossible today. We did our instrument work by flying approaches into Sky Harbor, Phoenix Sky Harbor. That's how much things have changed. Can you imagine trying to fly a practice instrument approach into Sky Harbor today? That absolutely wouldn't work. So after that, I was sent to Nellis Air Force Base, where things got serious. We hadn't lost many people up to that point, but at Nellis we were I should say inducted into the real Air Force. We're learning how to use the airplane as a weapon, dropping bombs, shooting machine guns, and flying night formation in an F-80. The F-80 was a benign, wonderful little airplane, but they tried to improve the range by putting bigger tip tanks on it. These tip tanks carried 265 gallons, and they had no baffles in them. So if you started getting them sloshing, you went up and down like that. It was exciting, to say the least. I remember one night, 16 ship formation, night formation, 4 flights of 4. Fortunately, I was the number 4 in the last flight, and all of a sudden the whole sky lit up. And the leader said, "What the hell happened?" One of the flight leaders, wasn't mine, but he said, "I just lost my wingman." He didn't really say, "I lost my wingman." He said, "I lost my blank wingman. I see women here, so I won't fly." And that was the way things were. We had, over one weekend, we lost 6 guys, most of them in the traffic pattern. There was never time to go to the funeral because you were always busy, and the training was brutal. Again, the "Every man a tiger" was one of the most foolish slogans that the Air Force ever developed. We all had orders to Korea, but they decided that instead of going straight to Korea, they'd send us to the Philippines or the Okinawa or Japan first for additional training before going into combat. And by this point, they were withdrawing the F-80 from Korea anyway. So I was assigned to the Philippines. I reported in there to a remarkable man, a black man, a Tuskegee Airman. And the four of us stood in front of him, saluted, and shook in our knees. He had more combat time than we had flying time. He was a gifted leader. He looked us in the eye. He said, well, now, lieutenants, you've heard of organizations where they say, you play ball with me and I'll play ball with you. He said, well, I want you to know in this organization, you play ball with me or I ram the bat up your ass. That was the Air Force at that time. But Colonel McGee was a wonderful leader. And we had the ideal environment for a fighter pilot. 1 week we fired ground gunnery, 1 week air to air, 1 week we dropped live ordnance left over from World War II, and the fourth week we stood alert in Tainan, Formosa, to make sure the Chinese communists knew that we were there, which gave us free permission to buzz everything in town. So it was a good time. I remember probably one of the hairiest experiences I had in my life. I was assigned to ferry a couple of war-weary but rebuilt F-80s from Japan down to the Philippines. And I had as my leader on that one a deputy commander of the 44th who was a retread. He'd been forced back into the service, and the last thing he wanted to do was be there. But he didn't mind going to Japan to bring this airplane back, and so we went. And coming back, we were flying from Tokyo, Yokota, down to Itazuki, and he was leading and I was flying the wing. We got into a hell of a thunderstorm, a very exciting piece of weather. And all of a sudden he says, the call sign was Tomato. He says, Tomato 2, take over. My instruments are out. Well, we're right in the middle of a thunderstorm. The only instrument we had was an ADF. Of course, mine was going around like this too, because the ADFs weren't very good in thunderstorm. So I said, okay, and I took over, and the first thing I did was declare an emergency. I yelled, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. An Australian voice came on. He said, hi, Mike, what's up? I never will forget that, because I was scared to death. And I said, I thought we're lost. We don't know where we are, and we need to get on the ground because we don't have that much fuel. He said, don't worry. He said, we're good. We'll do an DF direction of finding mission on you, and then we'll take you down here to Iwakuni. Iwakuni was located in Hiroshima, and that hadn't been too long before that when the A-bomb was dropped, if you recall. But anyway, he did exactly as they told us when to turn, what to do, how to let down. And I will say that the major that was on my wing flew a good wing for me, right? Because he was probably as scared as I was. We got into the GCA, landed, taxied in, and I guess in a minute of my frustration, I said, Major, you're a dumb bastard, and I think I better lead the rest of the way. And he said, I agree. So I did. And we made it back to the Philippines. But it was, again, an idyllic 2 years in the Philippines working for a great man. And then when we went back to the States, I was assigned to the Instrument Pilot Instructor School at Moody Air Force Base, teaching people how to fly instruments. And which one of the great things is, if you teach something, you learn how to do it yourself, and I've always looked upon that as a great life insurance in my future flying. We also flew acquaintance, give acquaintance flights to the chief pilots of all the major airlines, because they were just transitioning into jets too. Now, interestingly enough, we didn't have VORs. We were flying radio range, just like Doug was, but with T-33s at 130 knots, it was an exciting time. And then if you really wanted to get a person a good workout, you gave them what was called an RDF let down. You all know what an ADF is. An RDF is when you manually adjust to pick up the no. Flying an RDF letdown in a jet is an exciting proposition. There was one guy there, his name was John Solar, who was a student of mine, who flew better than anybody else I've ever flown with, including Chuck Yeager. And he was eventually stationed at Luke, and the commander at Luke was Robert Scott. Remember, God is my co-pilot. How many ever remember that? I see enough to shake. He wrote, God is my co-pilot, and so every time he went on a cross country, he took John with him to make sure he got back. And so guess what John's nickname became? It was God. Yeah. Everybody all over Luke. Incidentally, Scott got cashiered out of the Air Force because he had the habit of taxiing by airplanes, writing down their serial number and then logging time in them that they'd only seen them. So he was kicked out. Good riddance. Excuse me. Well, anyway, we after 2 years at Moody teaching instruments, 4 hours of simulator in the morning, 4 hours of flying in the afternoon, and usually a night flight, and then a weekend cross country at least twice a month. So it was exciting, and I built a lot of flying time up. I can't match Doug on hours, but I bet I got you beat on landings. Because our missions were about an hour long. Anyway, from there we went to the Fighter Weapons School at Nellis, got introduced to the F-86, which was, in my estimation, still, for its time, the best airplane I've ever flown. And I got good company there because both Chuck Yeager and Bob Hoover have told me the same thing. They thought that was the best of all the airplanes they've ever flown. We were then transferred to Luke Air Force Base and got in the business of teaching people how to drop A-bombs from fighters. You come in on the deck at about 500 knots, pull up, and at a certain angle it released automatically, and then you continued on over with an Ullman and got back out of there. The fact a live one was never dropped from a fighter, and I'm not sure whether anybody would have ever gotten out of one if it had. But anyway, a little aside, our squadron insignia included a big bomb burst on the tail. When I restored an F-86 in later life, I was on an air show, and the lady came up to me, a young lady. How can you have that on that bomb burst on? That's and I said, well, that was our mission. We were teaching people how to. She gave me hell. Finally, I looked at her and said, you may be right. I only have one regret. She said, what's that? I said, I really wish I'd have got to drop a live one. She was really irritated.
Well put.
After a period at Luke, which was a great time, one of the other interesting things that happened while I was at Luke, one day an old school bus, a blue school bus, didn't have first student on it, but it came by and it had a bunch of old people in it, what we thought were old people, in khakis. No one said anything, but they were khakis. And turned out that soon we found out they were the old Luftwaffe pilots that are coming back, get checked out in the 84, and then go back and start the new German Air Force. And of course we all laughed at them. They're old guys, blah, 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 blah. We soon found out there was not a laughing matter. They were among the best pilots I've ever flown against. And they were some of them horribly disfigured, ears burned off, and everything else, but they were really competent people. And they formed a good Air Force, even though they had a lot of trouble with the 104. Well, after Luke, I got assigned to West Point teaching thermodynamics and fluid mechanics. And while I was there, Russia launched the Sputnik, and it soon became clear to me that there was going to be an enormous contest in space. Not just they're clear to me, but I think every other thinking American. I had a degree in aeronautical engineering. I had a lot of single engine time, so I thought, I probably ought to get out of the fighter business and go in the experimental test pilot business, and maybe we'll see where that leads. So I went to Edwards, taught there, went through the school, taught there. My boss was Colonel Yeager, Chuck Yeager, who was also a great boss. He gave you a job and left you alone. But at that point in his life, in the Air Force, he could really do things. He had the magic key. He wanted an F-104, he got them. So it was a very good period. And we started sort of the graduate school to the test pilot school, called the Aerospace Research Pilot School. And it was a tough curriculum. On one of our introductory flights, to see if we thought the guy could cut the mustard, we'd take him up in a T-33, put him in a spin. Most people had never spun a jet at that point. But you put him in a spin, and while he's spinning, shut the fuel off. So we had a flame out. And most of them hadn't had a flame out either. And so all of a sudden, here's in a spinning airplane without an engine. And then they wouldn't let them start it till it got low. We always had one great advantage, a huge, beautiful lake there. Lake bed, you could land anything in. So we washed out a lot of them that way before they ever got started. The ones that got through that school were really competent. And while we were there, of course, the Mercury program started. And they applied for the second group of astronauts. I came home and told Susan, I think this is an avenue that we ought to pursue, because clearly the Russians and the Americans are going to be involved in a space race. And I'd like to be in it instead of teaching all the time. And she said, good, whatever you want to do, I'll support you. So I applied, and it was interesting there, the process that the Air Force went through to select the people that they would submit to NASA for NASA's approval. The Air Force was chagrined because the Navy, and the first 7, the Navy and the Marines had taken all the good flights, and of course Grissom had lost his spacecraft, and so on and so forth. So they were determined that they were going to be better represented in the second group. We went to charm school. For a week we were sent to Washington and told to wear knee-length socks. And we were introduced to have lunch with generals so we could interface with important people. It was all baloney, but nevertheless we did it. And when we were finally selected, I think the Air Force submitted 6 or 7. We were all ushered into General LeMay's office. General LeMay was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and he was a formidable person. He had Bell's palsy, one side hung down like this, and he was sitting behind his desk, and the 4 of us reminded me a little bit of reporting into the Philippines, the 44th, except now we were majors. And he said, I just want you to know that your mission is to go to NASA and make the Air Force look good. Do you understand? Anybody that would have said he didn't understand had more guts than I'd ever believe. We all said yes, and away we went, and we started our experience in NASA. NASA was in the middle of the Mercury program at that point. We went down to watch Wallace Schirra's flight and then Cooper's flight. And we, of course, interfaced with the first 7. The first 7 became instant celebrities and heroes. And I must say that of all the first 3 groups of astronauts that I was associated with, they were all very, very competent people. Their careers on Earth have been, what should I say, diverse. Not so exemplary, but nevertheless. In space, except for Carpenter, they all did their job. Carpenter was worthless, and he eventually never flew again. In my estimation, of the first 7, the most competent was Deke Slayton. He was grounded with a heart murmur or fibrillation, and that was one of the best things that ever happened to the program, because he was then put in charge of the astronaut office, a man of impeccable integrity, totally devoted to doing the job, and he selected the crews for the flight. And he had such a reputation among the astronauts that when Deke said it, that was it. He didn't have any second guessing. After Slayton, I had to pick Schirra, then Shepard and Glenn, Grissom, Cooper, and then finally Carpenter. Our 9 group, in my estimation, were all very, very competent people, and they all did well. Elliot C. was probably the weakest pilot. He flew a T-38 into a factory at St. Louis and killed him and Charlie Bassett. But the cadre there was excellent people. The people on the ground, wonderful people. People like Chris Craig. We had there people who cared, who devoted their whole life, both in the air and on the ground, to beating the Russians to the moon. It was a great place to work. Full of competent people, fully energized down to the janitor level. And of course, you know the results of that. We stumbled badly with the Apollo fire. I was appointed on the committee to help investigate the Apollo fire. It was a very, very telling time because these people weren't used to death, and all of a sudden we had to kill 3. They were taken to drinking too much, taking downers and uppers, but eventually they worked out of it. Those of those that had been in the Air Force, I think, had an advantage to that. I remember one night afterwards, after the fire, Max Figet, who was a brilliant engineer, several other of us were down at, and Deke Slayton and myself. We had a little too much to drink, threw our glasses at the fireplace, and went on about our business the next day. Joe Shea, who was the program manager, never got over it. He unfortunately was replaced and had mental problems the rest of his life. Another extremely competent civilian contractor man gave us a briefing one time. He was on the team investigating the fire also. I remember he started drawing a picture of or an organizational chart for heaven. He labeled God Big Daddy. And he babbled and babbled and babbled, and finally they took him out of there in a straitjacket. So it was a trying time. But 18 months later, Apollo 7 flew. And I was at, and it flew perfectly for 11 days. I was out at Downey, California, checking out our spacecraft one day when I got a call from Slayton. He said, "Come back right away to Houston, I gotta talk to you." I said, "Talk on the phone, I'm really busy." He said, he reminded me who the boss was, and back I went. I walked in the door and he said, "Shut the door," and so I knew something's up. He said, "We've got word that the CIA tells us the Russians are gonna try to fly a mission to the moon, around the moon, before the end of the year." This was 1968. We think we're gonna change Apollo 8 mission, which was Jim McDivick's mission, to a lunar orbital mission. Do you want to do that? I said, "Absolutely. I want to do that." So we starting in August, trained for a flight in December. Usually it takes 18 months to prepare for a flight, but we were competent. We did it. The reason they switched crews, McDivick's crew was ahead of us, and they had done a lot of time in the lunar module. I'd never even been in a lunar module simulator, so we were the logical ones to go to the moon with just a command module. The Saturn V, still the most powerful machine that was ever built, functioned perfectly every time it was manned, and it was. I must tell you truthfully that we are indebted to Operation Paperclip that brought all the German scientists over here after the war, because they were led by Werner von Braun, a brilliant engineer and a great leader, and the results proved that we could have never gotten to the moon in the 60s without the von Braun team. in my estimation. I remember I was on the crew safety committee, and I went spent a lot of time in Huntsville. We were working on failure modes that were too quick for human reaction. You have to have an automatic sequence, a sensor that would eject the spacecraft. So you think about, okay, most of them occur right at liftoff. You got a hard over of one of the gimbals. You get a pitching moment that we couldn't react in time enough to. So you put in a rate gyro. Okay, that's not, now if the rate gyro picks it up, away you go. But what if the rate gyro fails? Well, we'll put in 2 rate gyros. Which one do you believe? So we finally put in 3 and voted them. If 2 said go, you went. It was that kind of an engineering process. Now I read in the paper the other day where what's this guy Musk is going to send 2 civilians to the moon in 2018. My answer to that is good luck. I think he's a great promoter, but I don't think it'll ever happen. If it was, I sure wouldn't. They've never even flown rockets big enough to do the mission. It's unbelievable. Of course, not many people can have so successful with a company that's never made money either as much. So we'll see. And Apollo 8, the word was out that I was offered Apollo 11. That's nonsense. I had never even been in a lunar simulator, and I could never done it. Slayton had a program for selecting crews after you were a backup. Three missions later, you were the prime. Armstrong crew was the backup for us, and 3 years later, 3 missions later, they threw Apollo 11. I'd like to tell you that it was a heroic mission, that Apollo 8 was involved a lot of piloting, and the fact is it all worked perfectly. We had no troubles at all. Almost everything was for the first time, and it all worked perfectly. The most exciting part of the flight was the re-entry. Coming in at 25,000 miles an hour, you disturb the molecules in the air a great deal, and the temperature goes up to 5,000 degrees centigrade. So it was a exciting re-entry. We came back, and I was frankly, after Apollo 11, I lost interest in the Apollo program. I was there to beat the Russians to the moon. I was not a Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers guy. I read Smiling Jack. I like airplanes. I don't care about the spacecraft that much. So when the time came, I had the Air Force. I hadn't been to any of the schools. I didn't have any combat time. They didn't know what to do with me. They said, well, we'll put you in charge of the Air Force Manned in Space program. Well, it didn't take a genius to recognize that there weren't going to be 2 manned in space program. So I got out and retired and went to, moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, and started a small business with a friend of restoring airplanes. We started out with a Chipmunk. We'd restore it mostly by ourselves and then sell it, make a little money, and go on to the next one. Eventually we ended up with a P-51 that won both Oshkosh and Sun and Fun, and a P-63 that won both Oshkosh and Sun and Fun. Interestingly enough, the 63 was, in my estimation, a better airplane, more maneuverable airplane, a better fighter at low altitude than the 51. The trouble was it couldn't go anywhere. It didn't have enough fuel to do anything. You had to create drop tanks, and you couldn't drop them if you wanted to go anywhere. So the 51, I think, ended up being the primary, in my estimation, the best fighter. In mine, a lot of people, best fighters of World War II. We took it all the way from, we flew air shows from Alaska to Florida and from Maine to California. We did celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary at an air show in North Platte, Nebraska. It was a great time. Along the way, I met a lot of great people. I told you I worked for Chuck Yeager. He's a piece of work, a cantankerous guy that a lot of people don't like. I respect him, love him. If the bill ever went up and I was young again and was going to combat, I'd want to go on Yeager's wing. He's a hell of a pilot. I knew another great guy I ran across was Robin Olds, who was also probably the premier fighter pilot of Vietnam and World War II, or maybe not World War II, but at least Vietnam. I knew Eddie Rickenbacker, but by then, when I had met him, he was in his, must have been almost old as I am, but anyway, he was a cantankerous old drunk when I met him, so, but I really respected him and what he had done. Hoover, so a class act, a gentleman, and I think probably the best stick and rudder man that had ever existed. And I'm not alone in that estimation, because Jimmy Doolittle, who I got to know pretty well, also told me that Hoover was the best that he'd ever seen or heard of. I asked him what was the most dangerous airplane he ever flew, and he said the GB. And he went on to tell me that he fortunately, when he tried out the GB, he tried it out first at altitude. He had only flown it from Springfield to Cleveland for the air races. Flew it. He said, I pulled too many G's and it spun magically. If I hadn't been at altitude, I'd have killed myself. I also got to know Lindbergh probably better than any of them, because we served together on several committees, and Lindbergh was a different kind of guy than the rest of them. Obviously very competent, but a very inquisitive person. The kind of person that wanted to understand, wanted to know. You know, you ever going to give a damn, just where do we go? But with Lindbergh, how do we get there? It's like trying to find out what goes on behind all the garment stuff now. But most people, I just want to know what button to push. Some of them want to know what makes it work, but like Lindbergh would want to. He wrote me, he was also intellectually very interested in the human race. He wrote me a letter from, he was with some very remote tribe in the Philippines. He was interested in everything. He was just a different kind of guy. So out of all of them, my pick is Jimmy Doolittle. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I've talked too long. It's time for questions and answers. And yes, sir. Remember, if you don't contribute, your bill goes up.
There you go. Just a simple question when you're sitting on top of that rocket, and that simple time from ignition till you hit outer space, what is that feeling?
Well, the question is, when you're sitting on top of the rocket, waiting for launch,
Right.
what are you thinking about? Well, contrary to the old Air Force, we had all kinds of checklists to go through. And we went through them not once, but twice. I remember sitting on top of that Saturn V. The Saturn V was 360 feet tall, which was taller than any building in Montana. It weighed 6.8 million pounds and generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And sitting there in the early morning, waiting for it to launch, you could hear it gurgle as they opened the valves and the fuel went down. And I remember looking out and seeing a seagull float. I often wonder what the hell happened to that bird.
Chicken dinner.
But the Saturn V was an old man's launch, really. I mean, the maximum G's were 6 G's, as I remember. Now you can go look up in the manual somewhere, maybe it was 6.2, but it was around 6 G's. The Gemini flight launch vehicle, Titan II, went up to almost 8 G's, so it was a more rigorous launch. The Saturn V, once you went through the speed of sound, it was like riding on a very smooth day on an airplane. You could feel it when you steered it by the gimbals, so the thrust, the nozzles moving. You could feel that sort of a jerky way, but once it got into supersonic flight, it was wonderful. So I'll be honest with you, the thing that concerned me most was not the launch or anything else, but I was afraid, I knew darn well that they were going to check. We had to go around the Earth 1.5 times. I knew that they're going to be checking every systems possible before they committed us to a lunar insertion. And I was afraid that they'd find something wrong and I'd have to spend 11 days going around the damn Earth again. I'd already spent 14. You couldn't pay me. Listen, I admire the people that are up in that space station now. Some of them been up there a year, I guess. You couldn't pay me to do that. That's just not in my blood. That's not in my DNA. And I was afraid that I was going to end up spending 11 more days going around the Earth. But fortunately, it all worked perfectly. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Colonel, can you tell us in your mind, your feelings the first time you saw the Earth when you came around the moon?
Yeah, that was the question is, what were my feelings the first time I came around the moon and looked up and saw the Earth? Well, that's interesting because we hadn't seen the Earth because we were focused on looking at the lunar landscape for landing sites for a future mission. And then all of a sudden, on about the 8th or 9th revolution, we looked up and there was the Earth. And it was a remarkable sight. There, over this barren horizon was a blue marble with white clouds and brownish pink continents. It was a remarkable trip. It's the one sight from the flight that I still have. We live on a very, very beautiful planet, very remote. It's the only thing in the entire universe that we could see that had any color at all. Everything else was black and white. And here was this beautiful planet. And you just wonder why we have so much trouble here on Earth. But I guess it'll never end. But the fact of life is that was the most significant point of the whole fight to me, looking back at the Earth. Yes, sir.
So the reason we went to the moon was clearly because we wanted to beat the Russians. There's talk of going to Mars, but without that challenge, what's your sense of how long it'll take to get there, or will we ever go?
The question is, we went to the moon because we wanted to beat the Russians, that's clear, and we did. The question is, how long do you think we get to Mars? We don't have that incentive to beat anybody again. And as a matter of fact, I think if we do finally launch a mission to Mars, it will probably be an international venture like the space station. It's difficult for me to predict when you go to Mars. Aldrin's, who is a Looney Tune, as far as I know, suggested that we'll go to Mars tomorrow. But the fact of life is, it's going to be a very, very difficult proposition and very expensive. Bill Anders, who's a nuclear engineer and who I know very well, of course I flew with him on Apollo 8, he says that the radiation problems going to Mars are going to be phenomenal. And then I also read about, now we found there may be moisture on Mars, so we don't have to worry about fuel because we'll make fuel out of the moisture.
No.
I wonder what. It sounds like Musk again. and then you wonder about what do you do for radiation when you're on Mars? Because the atmosphere on Mars is about the equivalent to 100,000 feet here on Earth. And I hear, well, it's okay, we'll dig caves and live in caves. Well, I think it's a long way. Now, every president from the first Bush has said we're going to Mars. And I think they have made progress. And that may be the most significant contribution of the space station is the effect of on humans of long duration flight, because that's what it's going to take to go to Mars. But I wouldn't venture a guess, and I'm not smart enough to know, but only thing I'll say is I bet it's a long time. Yes, sir.
What individual had the most impact on your life?
What individual had the most impact on my life? Other than my parents. I think it was probably my high school football coach. It sounds trite, doesn't it? But he was a class act. I remember one time we went to Douglas, Arizona to play a game, and we had one black player on our team. And we were going to have lunch at the Gadsden Hotel. And the manager came out and said the black player would have to eat in the kitchen. And the coach said, no. We went across the street and bought bread and bologna and ate together. I think that was the biggest impact on my life. This was in 1945.
Yeah.
So it was early on. Yes, sir.
Was there much flying the Apollo 8, or did the computers do everything?
I'm sorry, did somebody tell me?
Did you fly Apollo 8,
Oh, could we fly Apollo 8?
or did the computers do?
No, the question was, did the computer, no, we flew Apollo 8, and the Apollo spacecraft and the Gemini spacecraft had wonderful control. It was, you could blip it, or the control jets could be just blipped. So you just take one blip and you start rolling, then you blip it again to stop it. It wasn't like there was no stability to it except for re-blipping. But it was, of course, there's no atmosphere, so you had no perturbations, and you flew it directly. Now, when we wanted to change the orbit, we had that big surface propulsion engine, and we could change the orbit. And we could compute online in the spacecraft exactly what we needed to do in order to change our orbit, and we did. But we compared it with the ground, and it was very close to what the ground had brought right up to it. So we had control of the spacecraft. Yes, sir.
What do you see for, what do you think is gonna happen with the future of space and space exploration?
I'm sorry, I don't hear with the damn. I'm getting a hearing aid on Wednesday.
What do you believe
Do
is
it.
gonna happen with the future of space and space exploration?
What's going to happen in the future of space? That's going to be interesting to see. My own feeling is with the deficit we have in this country, it's going to be very hard to what should I say?
Justify.
To schedule any really significant space adventures because they cost so much money. I hope that I firmly believe in space. I firmly hope that we go to Mars, but I'm afraid it's going to be a lot longer than most people think. Yes, Gordon.
Frank, you and dear Susan did so many cross-country flights together, traveled all over back and forth in so many different airplanes. Frank, which trip is the most memorable for you? Which plane did you fly, and what made it so?
The question is,
better than the
in our flights after NASA, which trip was the most memorable from my standpoint? Which airplane? And I think it's clear. We left Great Falls one morning in a P-51 and flew all day and landed in Anchorage, and that was a wonderful flight, flying up the same path that they had flown when they delivered the P-39s and P-63s to Russia. It was a great trip. The Canadians were wonderful. We again, remarkable that P-51 ran like a top. Here it was a 50-year-old engine, but it just ran like a top, and we had a great time in Alaska. So as I said before, my favorite airplane of all times is the F-86. Second is the P-51. Anything else?
Frank,
Yes, sir.
are you gonna come to our Hysham Lions Club flying breakfast again in August?
I'll be to the Hysham flying breakfast in August, what?
Second Sunday in August.
Second Sunday in August. Everybody heard that?
Yeah.
Hysham breakfast, second Sunday in August. Everybody be there.
Flying.
Yes, Doug?
On your Apollo 8, you had a 3-man crew, and what were the other 2 men's duties, or how did you spread the duties?
I can't hear you.
What were the duties of all the men?
Oh, what were the duties of the 3-man crew? Well, I had the overall command. I could make,
Delegate.
what should I say? I could handle the mission the other, not as well as they could, but I could have got us back. My main mission was re-entry. And I was prepared to fly re-entry manually in case we had to. Anders was the systems guy. He knew all the systems, and he also took the photographs of the future landing sites. Lovell was the navigator. Interestingly enough, after the flight, we we were sent on a tour to, through Europe. And I was ushered into the presence of General de Gaulle. And some of you old guys remember de Gaulle was a very imperious guy. He really made modern France after the war. But there was de Gaulle, an interpreter, and me. And everything, he asked me a question, and he flattered me because he'd done enough looking into the mission. He'd say, you know, why did you do this at 40 hours? I'd answer, and the guy would interpret it. Finally, he said, there were 3 of you on a very dangerous mission. How did you keep order? And I got kind of be a smart guy, and I said, well, please tell the general that there are 3 of us, but only 1 commander. And he looked at the interpreter, and in perfect English, he said, don't bother, I understand that. That's a true story. Yes, sir.
Colonel Borman, what was the reentry profile like?
Well, the reentry profile on a Apollo was you come in at, I think you had to hit a 7-degree corridor. You come in, you dig into the atmosphere. The Apollo, even though it doesn't have wings, it had lift because of the offset GG. Then you come back out when you got to the maximum G load and heat load. You come back out, don't escape the atmosphere. Then you roll over and come back in. And so you control it by rolling. And as the Gemini, you didn't go back out, you just went in. It was like shooting, I flew a manual Gemini reentry. It was like shooting an ILS, except instead of banking 3 or 4 degrees, you're banking 180 or 200 degrees. But the Apollo was a skip reentry.
How many G's were on the?
We took 6 G's for about 5 minutes. It was a long haul. We had to slow up from 25,000 miles an hour. Yes, sir.
This is what I just have to ask. This goes to your Eastern Airlines days. I was in my early Air Force days in Tucson, Arizona, when it was a much sleepier town than it is today. And you took the helm of Eastern Airlines in the late 70s. And Eastern Airlines announced nonstop Atlanta to Tucson service. And the rumor was that you had a direct hand in that particular flight being established, because the market certainly wasn't.
The question was, did I intervene when I was at Eastern to get a flight from Atlanta to Tucson? And the answer is no, we had a planning session that did that. I had enough problems about worrying about stuff like that. Yes, sir.
Do you have a favorite civilian aircraft?
Favorite civilian aircraft?
That's tough.
I suppose I should say Bonanza because everybody thinks that's the best thing going, but I think my favorite civilian aircraft was a Waco SRE that we rebuilt, and maybe it's because I spent so much time rebuilding it, but it had a 985 in it, and it would cruise really just as fast